Hello everyone, Books with Banks back again with another video today, and today I'll be reviewing the super popular romance fantasy book Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. This was published earlier this year, 2023. I will be starting out spoiler free, and partway through the video I'll clearly signal when I'm going to make that shift into more spoilery kind of discussion territory. But before I get too far in this, thank you all to those of you who've already helped me reach more than 400 subscribers. A year ago, I never thought I'd, could get even up to 100. And I'm actually now, I'm hoping that maybe I could get to around 500 or so by the end of the year. So if you haven't already, it really would mean a lot if you could please like and subscribe. Share this video with anyone you think might be interested in this book or my channel in general. For today's review, what is this book about? Fourth Wing, I'll set it down, but Fourth Wing tells the story of a young woman named Violet. She has some form of like a brittle bone condition where even like the simplest fall or stumble could result in like a broken leg, or if she hits her shoulder, bumps her shoulder, she could really hurt herself. Anyway, she attends Basgiath War College, wherein she's been training to be a scribe to work with the records and archives in the school's library. Her mother, however, is high up in the chain of command with the Dragon Riders, and the Dragon Rider kind of quadrant's one of four major quadrants, one of four kind of like majors at a school, or at this college. And at the beginning of the book, Violet's world has been turned upside down as suddenly her mother is demanding that she follow in her own and her elder siblings' footsteps and start up with the Dragon Riders. The biggest problem here is that this quadrant of the school is incredibly brutal and has a high mortality rate, and that's for students in peak physical conditions, which unfortunately Violet comes in where she really isn't. Anyway, the rest of the book chronicles Violet's struggles and triumphs, attempting to survive the various challenges that are put before these students, be they lethal vertical obstacle courses, lethal fellow students, or even just the constantly annoying overprotectiveness of one of her friends. Her goal is to eventually become a dragon rider like her mother and her brother and sister before her. And along the way, she'll enter into a tense and dark romantic subplot. She also makes several friends and enemies, and she even begins to unravel some of the mysteries behind not only the magic of dragons, but also kind of the mysteries behind the real political warfare kind of situation across the continent. So that's basically, in short, what the book is about. Now, how did I come to read this book? Add it to my TBR, because this was definitely not on my TBR a few months ago. But recently, it appears that this novel has been getting rave reviews elsewhere on BookTube, but also on platforms like TikTok. And then my fiance, who through things like the works of Sarah J. Maas, my fiance started to get more and more into reading fantasy. She decided to pick this book up as well, and she absolutely loved it. And her friends who she either got to read it or who were already reading it, depending on, which friend we're talking about, they all also loved it, to the best of my knowledge. And I always enjoy having a number of people around with whom I can talk about fantasy books with, so it seemed like kind of the logical choice for me to give this one a go so I could participate in their conversations. And by the end of it, I'm actually very glad that I did read this book. It's definitely not my favorite book I've read this year. In fact, if I had to do like a ranking of everything I've read, it would rank closer to the bottom. But just for reference, for those of you who prefer like star ratings, even if I rank this near the bottom, I'd still probably give it at least like a 3-star rating, something like that. So I enjoyed my time reading this at least 60% of the time. Not bad, right? Now, let's go over some of the spoiler-free good and bad elements of the book if you're curious to give it a go. And of course, I hope this goes without saying, but when I say good and bad, I'm strictly talking about my subjective tastes and preferences. So, the good. 1. This book, Fourth Wing, reminds me a lot of kind of the high stakes battle school, violent school type of stories we get in things like Ender's Game, or even a couple of kind of the middle, more violent Harry Potter books. And the students in this book, even though they're like at least college age, but they're still students, they're dying left and right. This all sets the stakes very high and keeps readers on the edge of our seats, hoping some of our favorites and some of our favorite Violet's classmates make it through each successive challenge that's put before them. So I think that's definitely a positive. I think Yarros nails that kind of battle school aspect and the tension there pretty well. And second, I think Yarros really understands how to sell the coolness and the mythic but violent beauty of dragons. Most dragons in the book don't appear for a little ways into the story, but when they do show up, it's almost always one of the better moments, one of the better scenes here. Third positive, there are genuinely really satisfying moments in this book where Yarros has been building tension. She's foreshadowed a few certain elements of the world, certain things that could result in some kind of plot twist, and then bam, she's able to deliver these great turning points and scenes that weren't necessarily predictable, but they were always foreshadowed and set up well enough in some way where they're not totally unexpected, but they're really, really satisfying. I'll go into a few more specifics about a good example of a scene like this in the spoiler section. The fourth positive thing I'll say about this, fourth and kind of less positive thing I'll say about this, this is the second book I've read this year that kind of fights back against that really outdated and sexist idea that, like, the guy who is trying to protect the weak girl somehow deserves her, or deserves a romantic connection there for his kind of unasked for and often overbearing protection. Even if guys think being protective makes them the nice guy, that obviously absolutely should never have any bearing on who the protected woman should want to wind up with. The book highlights that this kind of overly protective nice guy behavior can often be really condescending and inappropriate, and I think that's wonderful, and I think Yarros handles that topic really well. So now for what I didn't like so much about the book. Just kind of 3 points here. First, this is totally just a matter of preference, but this book is written in first person, present tense, which is a format, POV and tense that I'm not used to it, and I find it pretty jarring. Now, obviously, this sort of thing could be a major positive for other readers, or for some of you if you do read a lot from this point of view, kind of tense combination, but it's definitely not something I'm super familiar with. So that alone did take me out of the story, especially at first. Did take a little while for me to warm up to. Second thing I wasn't the biggest fan of, while I like romance and fantasy, this is a point that I've made in other videos, sometimes the romance here in Fourth Wing, it felt just a little bit weird to me. For instance, picture a scene in which students are about to attempt a trial that they might die during, and then our main character is thinking about how hot a guy is, or how frustrated she is with herself for being attracted, and frustrated with her body for feeling attracted to this guy. Again, all the while classmates are either about to attempt these deadly challenges or dying in the process of dying during those challenges. It's a little strange, like, is it believable that these characters are thinking about kind of more romantic things, like sexual things, during these death-defying stunts? I don't know. Third thing that I wasn't the biggest fan of, kind of following on from that same point, when I say the characters are thinking about how hot a guy is, I kind of mean this literally with the type of diction that Yarros uses. The point of view was already taking me out of the story a little bit, but then when characters are being described as, like, so effing hot, and other kind of, like, really more contemporary expressions of, like, attraction and lust, I really did find that jarring as well, because I'm far more used to fantasy books that rely on a slightly archaic vocabulary to better convey that kind of fantasy tone and setting. Yarros doesn't really do that. In other words, it's kind of like she's not going for the setting or tone of like a mystical, like other fantasy world, but instead she's going for the tone of just college kids, modern day college kids sitting around talking about who's hooking up with who, and using the same kind of language that we'd all use, or college kids would use today, as opposed to what we might think characters in a fantasy world would be saying, or, different idioms they might be using in a fantasy world. So yeah, that always kind of took me out of the story a little bit. All that said, though, I did enjoy the book. Not my favorite fantasy book ever, but I still can't wait for the sequel, especially with how exciting the kind of setup and implications we're left thinking about by the end of this first one. I'm really excited to see where Yarros takes that. If you're a fan of dragons, battle schools, and or romance fantasy or romantasy, then I definitely encourage you to give Fourth Wing a try. Fourth Wing, again, that's by Rebecca Yarros. And now, if you don't want any spoilers, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye. But I'm going to dive into spoilers now. So, the main satisfying moment that really started to get me invested in the story, that I referenced, I was going to give an example of how Yarros pulls off these satisfying moments. The moment I was talking about is when our main character, Violet, is looking for a dragon to bond with in the threshing ritual challenge ceremony kind of scenario, where they're all walking around kind of this like area looking to bond with dragons, but the dragons can also just kill people they don't like. In the midst of this scenario, Violet, she finds herself defending a weak little golden or younger golden dragon, and she's defending this dragon against these murderous classmates of Violet's who want to kill the dragon because the dragon's really weak, but that's also the reason why a lot of them have been wanting to kill Violet herself, so it makes sense why she would defend this dragon similar to her. And in the midst of her heroics and her trying to defend this dragon, the most powerful dragon swoops in and bonds with our hero. And so the golden dragon also will eventually bond with her. But yeah, just how Yarros kind of handles this whole moment of payoff, this whole scene, from the different teases about the different dragon types, to all the hard work and training we've seen Violet putting into kind of working towards success in this school to defy the odds, and even some hints that Yarros has put in there about the mysterious Xaden, who was also present during this confrontation, and how he may have tried to help her in this moment if that dragon hadn't come in to help first. All of this really comes together in easily one of the most satisfying moments I've read in a fantasy book all year. So yeah, there you go, a specific example of what I think Yarros does really well, what I think she does best. Now, let's talk about Dane and Xaden, the two sort of love interests, until one definitely isn't and one definitely is. So I've recently read the first couple Sarah J. Maas ACOTAR books. Light spoilers inbound for those two books, in 3, 2, 1. The Dane and Xaden dynamic here in Fourth Wing reminds me very much of the Tamlin-Rhysand dynamic in Maas's books. I do think it's a positive to make sure our Danes and our Tamlins aren't presented as heroes deserving of anyone's affection. I really respect both authors for including this element in their storylines and centering the importance of the female protagonist's decision-making and independence, and making all of that around the protagonist, the female protagonist, making all of that much more important than how loving or caring some guy might be. But having read some of ACOTAR first, having read that only earlier this year, just a few months ago, I did kind of feel like I wasn't reading anything too original or too similar when I got to this book. All that to say, basically, maybe I would have felt the opposite way if I read Yarros' Fourth Wing before Sarah J. Maas's ACOTAR. So yeah, just know that there is a similar kind of element there. And if you're looking for something romance very, very different from ACOTAR, maybe don't give this a try just yet, unless you don't really care about the romance in the story. I should also add, I have only read, or I should stress, I've only read the first two Court of Thorns and Roses books. And, of course, I've only read the first Fourth Wing book, because it's the only one that's out so far. So these relationships could develop in tons of different ways and directions that really differentiate themselves. But yeah, where I'm at reading both series, I did feel a little bit samey. Anyway, let's see, what else can we talk about? For themes and kind of more thought-provoking concepts and through lines, I'd say the biggest takeaway in this area is just stressing how important it is for individuals to find their unique strengths and to build confidence in themselves. I do think we see this subtle yet interesting shift from how kind of brutal and self-interested this school and this whole world is presented to be, and how the characters have to be really self-interested in this kind of self-preservation, deaths around the corner kind of mindset. That's where everyone kind of starts out at the beginning of the book. There's so much of that to the point where everyone understands that it's sensible for classmates to want to murder other weaker classmates. But despite that really kind of dark tone and kind of mood that everyone has early on in the story, slowly but surely that whole you can only rely on yourself idea starts to slip away as a really solid core group of supportive friends forms throughout the book. So I guess while her dragons, Violet's dragons, and her friends literally help her in training in various ways to make it through school, they are also helping Violet in more subtle ways to build her self-confidence and to build out this team mentality. So much so that when Xaden drops his kind of plot twist, this really big turning point near the end of the book, Violet, sure, she's hurt and upset, but she's not really unprepared for anything. She makes decisions with clarity and conviction, even at that kind of moment of panic in the end. And despite the other emotional distress of having her world flipped upside down, she's still strong enough by the end of the book with her team to fight for what is right and to fight when it matters most. So yeah, that's sort of my kind of messy attempt to put together some sort of thematic analysis of the book. I do think at least at this early point in the series, Yarros hasn't really made her themes the focus nearly as much as the romance and the action. And that's fine, that might work really well for some of you. But it can make it just a little bit more difficult to have those kind of thematic, kind of thought-provoking conversations about her work, again, at this point. And those kind of conversations just so happen to be one of my favorite things to kind of sink my teeth into with sci-fi and fantasy. But I kind of mentioned her characters. Let's talk about the characters in a little more depth. So her best friends, I think it's Ree and Riddick. They're two fun supporting characters. And I honestly really hope we get more of them in the sequel. We know where Violet stands with the revolution and how everything's been turned around at the end. But I'm really curious what Yarros is going to do as far as Violet's friends that are still back at the school. I'm really hoping Yarros does something interesting with what are sure to be kind of these strained, newly strained, intense friendships. Maybe friends turn rivals, maybe tense scenes, or maybe we'll get some tense scenes where there's like a battle going on and these people who used to be friends and classmates, they'll spare each other on opposite sides of a battle. That could be really exciting for future books. But as for this one, there's only one side character who I felt like really, really stood out as a really fascinating character, and I think that's Liam. Now I'm guessing Yarros put a little more work to develop or into developing this guy because she wanted his death in the end to really have a gut-wrenching emotional impact, and it worked. Like, she really did that well. She built his character well enough and built that death scene well enough. This is another scene I think Yarros did very well. Actually, not only was Liam's death scene well constructed, But I think I might actually prefer a moment slightly earlier in the book during a battle game where Violet's kind of most evil classmate has stabbed Liam, and Liam falls off his dragon, and Violet and her dragons have to swoop in and kind of save Liam with old and new magical abilities. That scene I think was excellent, and all the information packed into that moment. Another example of these really satisfying moments of payoff. And then, last but not least, or maybe least depending on why you're reading this book, but let's talk about the sex scenes. There's only a couple. Both are pretty intense and descriptive. The first one in particular. I also always do like when there's a slight element of comedy or awkwardness thrown into a sex scene. And that definitely happens here, at least the first time, what with kind of the room getting destroyed, the lightning and everything. I will say though, this didn't do it for me as much as some of my other kind of favorite romances and love scenes in other books. And I think it might have to do with how Yarros writes it very much as like lust and passion fueled, and the passion just got too much and they just needed each other too much. And it's much more focused on that lusting kind of side of the thing than it is on the tenderness or the like true love on that kind of side of these types of scenes. So yeah, the passion's definitely there, and Yarros writes that very well, if in kind of strangely modern language. But the more romantic side of the romance, the more kind of heartfelt and tender stuff, that wasn't there so much. The characters say nice and romantic things, but a lot of what we see happening is very intense, passion-driven, kind of lusting kind of scenes, which is fine, but the characters are pretty adamant by the end of the book that they really do love each other, so I think I would have liked to have seen more evidence beyond just the lust and the passion. And Xaden, I should talk a little bit about him. He's probably like the second most important character. He's a mysterious, brooding, violent, hot guy who looks good with his shirt off in the gym, comes from a politically shady background. That's basically all he is for at least the first 2/3 of the book. But then when we do start to find out more about him, that actually only furthers my comparisons between him and one of Sarah J. Maas's characters, Rhys. Like both of these guys being a little bit darker, brooding a little bit, sort of being martyrs for their people in certain kind of ways. But yeah, Xaden's a fine love interest. Nothing much else to say about him at this point, though. So there you have it. That's my book review and spoiler-free and spoiler-filled thoughts on Rebecca Yarros' Fourth Wing. A good book, not my favorite, but still well worth the read, and I'm honestly really excited to see what comes next. Thanks.